Hello everyone, welcome to Unit 2 of the MAAF subject. We're talking about business risk. So, first of all, what is risk? The definition is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So whether or not the organization is actually going to achieve its risks, what are the potential pitfalls that may stop the business from achieving these risks? The MAAF critical file gives us various ways that you can identify business risks. Most of them are self-explanatory, so physical inspection, contract review, historical analysis, and so forth. There's generally two sources of risks. Number one is internal. Number two is external. So internal is things that are within the organization and within its control, so people, processes, etc. Whereas external is things that are outside of the organization and outside of its control, e.g. the industry that it operates, competitive pressures, commercial constraints, the physical environment, and so forth. So we've got here in our list is a list of top 10 business risks. Now generally when you do the exam, you'll be able to gauge what these risks are from the question, just from the background information. You don't necessarily need a list in your notes to just draw from. It's kind of reading it and then making sense of it. But if you can't think of anything in your exam, you could always refer back to this list and you might go, oh, I've forgotten pricing pressure. Oh, I've forgotten market risks. But it has to be supported by the background information to the question. So the top 10 ones are pricing pressure, cost cutting, market risks, macroeconomic risks, managing talent, expansion of government role, regulation compliance, sovereign debt, emerging technologies, political shocks. So the first part is a deep dive into identifying the common risks to which the business may be exposed. So we talked about the top 10 business risks for international organizations. And now we're going to talk about the top 10 business opportunities. So innovation, emerging markets. I'm not going to go through each of these because it's not important to. Like I said before, when you do your exam, most of these, whilst you might get asked what are the top opportunities for this particular business, what are the top risks for this business, you better gauge that from the question. You don't need a list here. It's just more for inspiration in your exam. So I'm going to skip through that. Going back to the categories of risks, again, this isn't too important for your final exam. It's more just helping you, I guess, go through the thought process of identifying the correct risk for a particular theoretical company. So financial risk, strategic risk, operational risk, compliance risk, reputational risk, environmental risk, disaster risk are the categories of risk. And then what the chapter goes through is a summary of each of those categories of risk. So for example, strategic risk, just going in and understanding what it is. Now you might get a question in your exam where it might actually say, give us 3 examples of a strategic risk or an operational risk. So in that sense, it is good to understand what each of them mean. So strategic risk is very high level. So it's something that results from or impacts on decisions made in the boardroom. So, very top level to do with where the business is heading, where it's achieving goals, objectives, etc. So it's not related to day-to-day stuff. It's not at the small level. It's very high level at the board level. Okay, and then we've got some tables in here from the CSG, which gives you some sources of internal strategic risk. And I'm not going to go through these in detail because you don't need to know them. Like I said before, I think it's just important that you understand what the categories of risk are, and then learning by doing lots of past papers how to actually identify it in the question. So the next category of risk that we'll talk about is operational risk. So this is the risk that arises from the organization carrying on its business. So that could be from processes, from people, from systems, or events. So for example, inadequate controls and processes is one. For people, it could be human errors and lack of skills or fraud. For systems, it's technological failure, data, new applications. And events is infrastructure failure, customer legal action, and equipment failure. So let's just choose one random example and then you allocate as to which category you think it falls under, or I should say subcategory of operational risk. So operational risk is either processes, people, systems, or events. So let's give one practical example that you might see in the background of a question, which is high staff turnover. This is an operational risk, and this would fall under people. Now, another potential example you might see in the text is maybe the data is corrupted. Would that fall under processes, people, systems, or events? Think of data. So it's going to be systems. The only other one you might think is processes, but because data is to do with the actual software systems itself, it would be systems, not processes. Processes is like actions and things that are set up to do in a certain way that may failure. For example, control risk, authorization risk, and so forth. Okay, so let's move on to the next category in this little shape over here. So we're going to talk about compliance risk next. So compliance risk is basically the risk associated with not complying with relevant legislation and regulations, and it's also known as legal and regulatory risk. It could be internal or external. So it could be just complying with your own organization's policies and procedures. For example, HR, could be security, etc., internal policies. Or it could be external, for example, government legislation. It could be work health and safety. You're not complying with that, and you might get a penalty. It could be ASIC, not complying with the actual setup of the company. ATO, it could be tax, etc. Next one is reputational. So this is the risk of damage to an organization's image or brand. Next one is environmental risk. So this is the risk that a business's actions will result in a negative environmental impact. For example, if you're a mining company, are you going to, recently there was one in the news where a company, Rio Tinto, blew up this Aboriginal landmark, and this resulted in negative press for the company. Next category of risk is disaster risk. That's basically exposure to natural and man-made disasters. For example, natural disasters might be cyclones, earthquakes, bushfires, floods, while man-made disasters might be terrorism and civil conflicts and so forth. Then finally, let's talk about financial risk. So this is basically risk from participating in financial markets. So this could be arising from transacting in foreign currencies, could be from raising debt, the interest rate risk. Could be the interest rate risk from having too much money to invest and not taking advantage of attractive investment rates. Or it could be the commodity risk, so using or selling commodities, and just the fluctuation in price of those commodities. Now, within the financial risk category, there's also these sub-risks. So still within financial risk, we've got liquidity risk, which is basically the company might not have enough financial resources to meet its liabilities in the short term. There's credit risk, which is the risk that the other party to a financial transaction will not meet its obligations on time. For example, you might be a big property constructor and you've got a whole lot of contracts, but if people don't settle their apartments, you won't be able to pay all the suppliers building the apartment. Equity risk, which is basically the risk that movements in the stock prices will adversely affect investor returns. For example, you might be a hedge fund and the movement in the equity prices is sometimes outside of your control. For example, recently with the COVID crisis, there was a huge crash in the stock market, and that was completely outside of anyone's control. And then there's commodity risk, which we mentioned above, which is the change in commodity price. There's the interest rate risk, which we talked about, which is the movements in the interest rates. And then there's foreign exchange risk. So these are all subcategories of the financial risk category. Okay, so once we've talked about identifying all of the risks and you understand what each of the risk categories are, we're going to talk about applying the risk management process. So this is basically the structure used to control risk within the organization. The first step of this process is to set a risk appetite. So this is asking the board, the company, how much risk are we actually willing to take? For example, you might be a hedge fund who's willing to take a high level of risk in your investments. Alternatively, you could be a pension fund and you're dealing with people who are very close to retirement and you've got a very low risk appetite. So there's no one straight answer. Every different company may have a different risk appetite, but it's just identifying it and then setting the framework in place so that the actions of the company stay within our risk appetite of that particular company. Okay, risk management. So in order to grow shareholder value, which is the ultimate goal of a company, the management needs to adhere to a basic framework. So number one, seeking risk or exploring avenues for growth. Because risk isn't always bad, right? Because if you want to grow your company, you need to take a risk. As long as that risk is within an appropriate level and one that the company is comfortable with, it can actually be a good thing, a small amount of risk. So next step is managing the risk. So following the right growth pattern and making the correct risk decisions. And number three is generating opportunities across the organization as a whole. Now, there's actually some risk management guidelines, which we don't really talk about too much in MAAF. They're called, well, they're a subset of the ISO standards. There's one listed here in the notes, which is risk management principles and guidelines. Don't worry too much about this. It doesn't come up in exams. But it actually gives us a risk management process that we can follow. If this is something that you might be interested in for your own career, it might be worthwhile reading through this in your own time. But just at the very high level, it's basically number one, establish the risk context. Number two, conduct risk assessment. Number three, risk treatment plans. Number four, monitoring and review. Number five, communications and consultation. Okay, now we're up to part three, which is assess business risks for an organization and apply strategies to treat these risks. So there's two commonly used tools for assessing risks, and this is when it actually starts becoming useful, and you might get an exam question on this. So two commonly used tools for assessing risk. So number one are risk scorecards. Number two, risk matrices. Now you might get a question where you actually have to fill out one of these two tools for a particular case study. So they'll give you background information, and then you have to identify all the risks and allocate, risk score, so forth. So the first one we're going to talk about is the risk scorecard. And it looks like this. So if you can just bring up your screen. It's effectively assigning a score to each risk, which is a factor of the likelihood and the impact. So likelihood is basically how likely is this event going to happen. For example, terrorism is very low likelihood. Okay, it's probably 1 being lowest. Whereas alternatively, there's an example down here, hazardous waste. For example, pollution from your car or so forth, relatively high risk. There's a high chance of it happening, so that would be a high number. Now, the other element to this is impact. So if this did happen, how bad would this be, basically? So a terrorist attack would be very high. So the impact of that would be very high. So you'd have damage to infrastructure, you'd have loss of profits, you'd have damaged consumer sentiment, the stock market might go down and so forth. So very high impact. And basically what we do is we multiply the two together, and that equals our risk score. So for example, the terrorism, low likelihood, we've given it a 1 score. High impact, 8. So basically we times 1 by 8, and that gets our risk score, so 8. So operational risk, business continuity during a fire event, so fairly low risk, so 2 here. And then impact, probably 5. I mean, it would be bad. You might lose your store, but it's not the end of the world. You don't have insurance and so forth. So that one would be 2 times 5 equals 10. Compliance risk, taxation law, so likelihood of being audited, etc. Is low. So 2, impact is probably 3 because we've got strong internal control. So that one would be a 6. Environmental health would be quite high. So high impact of it happening for this particular company. And then high likelihood and high impact. So we're allocating this one 8 and 8, that'll be 64. So basically you go through that process for each of the risks, and then when you get this total score, this risk score, you basically sort it from highest to lowest, and the highest ones are the most riskiest ones, and they're the ones that we should be focusing on as a company to try and reduce. That's basically how you do it. Now, a risk matrix, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It's basically a visual way of looking at it. It's and this might be a good way of doing, an acquisition board write-up in your career, or something like that. Any kind of board report as a visual way of representing how risky a particular deal is. So, kind of similar. So you've got your likelihood on your left, on your y-axis, and your impact on your x-axis, and you basically plot it on. So fairly similar. It's just a visual way of doing that. Very similar to the risk scorecard. So you might get that in your exam question. Probably more likely to do the table up above because you're not going to be drawing a table in your exam. Okay, and then what we've got as the next part to this topic is risk treatment. How do we actually respond to those risks once we've identified them? So we mentioned before there's risk appetite, so what you're willing to accept. There's acceptable risks and unacceptable risks. So if there's acceptable risks, it's basically just treating it to get them under control, reduce the risk level. And if it's unacceptable risk, then it requires further treatment. So treatment options here we've got are reduce, transfer, avoid, tolerate, or exploit. So reduce is basically implement controls, processes, or systems to eliminate or reduce the impact of the risk. Transfer is move the risk to another entity. For example, you might take out an insurance policy, you're actually just transferring the risk from you to the insurance company. Avoid is ceasing doing something because the level of risk is too high and it cannot be treated. So for example, you might have a high risk project, we just basically abandon it. We don't do it anymore. That's how we avoid it. Tolerate it is basically to accept the risk and do nothing, or acknowledge nothing can be done and address the risk as it's too difficult or costly to do so. And then exploit, so take advantage of the opportunity the risk presents. So for example, update IT systems so that online ordering does not crash, creates an opportunity if competitors are still experiencing the same issues. Okay, so you might get an exam question where you have to identify the risk, assign a score and justify it, and then come up with a response as to how to mitigate that risk. That might be an example question you might get. Okay, moving on. So residual risk is basically any risk remaining after the risk treatment has been implemented. Hedging is basically a financial way of mitigating some risk. For example, if you're worried interest rates might go up, you can get a hedging instrument against the interest rate. So basically, you pay more now, and you don't have to pay it down the track. You're basically hedging that risk through a financial instruments. And you might do that in cases of volatility, in case you have a lower risk appetite than shareholders, if management has a superior knowledge compared to shareholders, and so forth. Reasons not to hedge. Organizations can make the wrong decisions with expensive consequences. Hedging adds no value as financial markets risks are diversifiable. The costs can outweigh the benefits. Depending on the derivative tool chosen, the upside market movements are foregone. Okay, so a natural hedge is when you don't actually need to take out a financial instrument to hedge. It's when when you've got an exposure to one risk is counteracted by a converse exposure to the equivalent risk. So, for example, a New Zealand company has sales in the UK, has a natural hedge if it also has an expense in that currency, which kind of offsets the revenue, basically. Okay, and then we're talking about derivatives, which I mentioned before is actually one of the financial instruments you can use to hedge. So there's two broad categories. There's exchange-traded derivatives and there's over-the-counter derivatives. So exchange-traded derivatives are the ones you can just buy on the stock market and have standard terms and conditions. Over-the-counter is basically an instrument tailored to the needs of the user. It's something you'd set up directly between two parties. So the types of hedging you can do to manage risk is no hedging, natural hedging, selective hedging. So that's basically choosing a percentage of the risk and hedging it. Number 4, hedging reticular risky exposures as opposed to less risky ones. So just selecting certain areas in your group, or 100% hedging, which is just hedging everything. And the 4 main tools of derivative tools for hedging are interest rate swaps, forward rate agreements, interest rate options, and futures. So a swap is basically an agreement between two parties to exchange a series of cash flows at some point in time. An interest rate swap is each cash flow is exchanged using market values determined by current interest rates. Forward rate agreement is basically an instrument used to hedge interest rate risk and is based on a notional principal amount. So it's fairly similar to interest rate swaps. They're relatively simple, short term, up to 1 year, and over-the-counter instruments. Okay. Let's talk about futures next. A future is it's a legally binding agreement to buy or sell a commodity or financial asset at a fixed price at a specific time in future. And they all have the same characteristics. So number 1, they're standardized. Number 2, they're traded on an exchange. Number 3, prices are quoted. Number 4, settled with a clearinghouse. Okay, so there's some advantages and disadvantages. So number one advantage is they're a liquid market because it's traded on stock exchange or whatever. There's a large amount of volumes. It's easy to sell, get in and out, and so forth. So leverage. The margin paid is only a small percentage of the underlying contract, which creates leverage and allows participants to make large profits from small capital outlays. Conversely, if the market goes against the participant, it can mean large losses. Cash settlement or physical delivery. Depending on the contract specs, for example, e.g. ASX wool futures delivery can be made with real wool. So basically, let me just get back to the fundamentals of what a future is. It's basically an agreement that in future, that one party has to deal either in cash or some sort of good. So for example, if you're a wool trader or a wheat trader or whatever, you're basically trading these agreements. So you have an obligation as a farmer to sell, 1 million tons of wool in June 2020. And you might be, putting that up as a future because you want to hedge part of your risks, right? But the market can also buy that contract because they might be speculating and think that the price of, wool might be going up in the future. So they're locking in prices today over what the price is tomorrow. So the market is trading on this. They're trying to make a profit on understanding the market better than the people selling it. And the people selling it are often just trying to hedge their risks. They'd rather take a small loss now or risk taking a loss just to have some confidence as to what the price is going to be in future. Okay, so let's move on to assess business risks for an organization and apply strategies to treat these risks. So foreign exchange risk management. So let's talk about foreign exchange. So there's 3 categories of foreign exchange risks. So number 1 is transaction, number 2 is translation, number 3 is economic. And as before, there's 5 different ways of hedging that you can do it: 100% selective, choosing risky ones over non-risky ones, no hedging, or natural hedging. Okay, so transaction exposure is basically the risk of engaging in financial transactions. For example, you might have regular transactions, you might be engaging in a very large supplier agreement and so forth, which is exposing you to a payable in the future, and the movements in foreign exchange might be throwing out that potential liability. Now, we've also got translation exposure, which is basically, when you're dealing with different currencies, eventually going to have to convert that into your functional currency or your reporting currency. And the risk is when you do that exchange rate, it's going to result in, a lower result for your company than you would under a different methodology or a different timing and so forth. And then finally, economic exposure is basically where just the whole value of the company can be influenced by the impact of foreign exchange risk. For example, you might have investments which are influenced by foreign exchange risk. You might have a number of transactions and so forth, which will impact cash flow, which the DCF valuation is based off for your business. Now, there's internal methods to actually manage that, i.e. natural hedges, which is just a deep dive as to one of these ones up here, so natural hedging. So the methods could be including pricing sales in the local currency, offsetting payments for imports in a foreign currency with revenues in the same foreign currency. So basically just netting off your revenue and your expenses in the same currency. Netting off accounts between affiliate companies. And intercompany forward contracts in which a holding company or central treasury acts as a banker to subsidiaries. And external techniques to manage FX risks, so financial products. So there's 3 main types of derivative tools, as we've been talking about before. So there's forward foreign exchange contracts, there's over-the-counter foreign exchange contracts, and exchange-traded future options. Now, if this doesn't make sense, don't worry about it too much. It's not really brought up in the exams very often. Basically, the core content in this is quite different to what you actually need to know for the exam, so don't worry about it too much. This is just to get a general understanding of the topic. It's more important that you just do past exams. Okay, so moving on. So external hedging techniques to manage FX risk. So this is just a deep dive of some of these that we talked about above. So forward foreign exchange contracts. So it's basically a legally binding agreement to buy or sell a specific quantity of currency in exchange for another at a future point in time. Over-the-counter foreign exchange is quite similar. It's basically got a call buyer anticipates that FX rates will increase in the future, therefore improving the value of the call option, and a put buyer. So it's basically two people on either side, quite similar to the will example I gave before, where one's trying to lock in a value and the other's trying to speculate on a higher value, and that value is constantly traded. Okay, so cross-country swaps is basically the exchange of cash denominated in two different currencies by an agreement between two parties. This is another FX hedging tool, basically. So you're basically agreeing, in 2020, in November, I'll exchange $1 million US for $950,000 euros or something like that. Now, where those currencies move in between is not their problem. You're just locking in that in advance, and it might be agreed on a spot exchange principle, so whatever the exchange rate is today, exchanging the interest rate payments during the term of the swap, and then so that's the end of the chapter. As I said before, if anything didn't make much sense, especially with all these derivative stuffs, don't worry too much. Like I said, it's just more important that you just practice doing the past exams. This is just for general knowledge. But anyway, I'll see you in the next video.